The great hall of the alien palace was filled with silence. High stone walls carried banners of battles won, and the floor was polished so well that the torches above reflected in it like small suns. Warriors of the Queen's Guard stood on each side, tall figures in dark armor, each one afraid to breathe too loudly. They had seen victory in countless wars, but today none of them dared to step forward. At the center of the hall stood the Queen. Her armor, black and silver, still smoked from the battle she had fought hours before. The chest plate was split across the center, deep scars burned through its surface. The shoulder guards were dented, the joints twisted. What had once been a perfect suit of protection now looked broken and weak. The Queen's voice filled the chamber. It was not a quiet voice, and it did not ask gently. She demanded that her armor be repaired, that her smiths bring it back to life before the next battle. Yet none of her people moved. They bowed their heads lower, avoiding her sharp eyes. Everyone knew that her armor was more than just metal. It carried energy fields linked to her very life. To break it was shame, to fail to repair it was worse than shame. The silence stretched. The Queen raised her head higher. Her gaze went from one warrior to another, from one servant to another. Still, no one stepped forward. Her patience began to burn away. Then, from the edge of the hall, a human stepped forward. His name was Aaron. He was not tall like the guards, nor did he wear heavy armor. His clothes were simple, marked by oil and grease, the clothing of one who worked with machines. His hands were rough, his fingers covered with tiny scars from years of building and fixing. In the sea of tall warriors, he looked almost small. Yet his steps did not falter as he walked toward the Queen. The warriors whispered. Some shook their heads, calling him foolish. Others smirked, waiting for him to be thrown out of the hall. No one believed a human could touch the Queen's armor and survive. Aaron stopped a few paces away, keeping his head low but his voice steady. He said he could fix the armor. His words were clear and calm, though they seemed to echo strangely in the vast hall. The Queen tilted her head. Her dark eyes studied the human before her. Her people had told her humans were weak, fit only for light labor or small duties. Yet here was one asking to touch the sacred armor. The Queen asked him why she should trust him. Aaron answered simply. He said that broken things were not a burden to him. They were puzzles, and puzzles had solutions if one searched long enough. He said the armor was not dead, only wounded, and that he could give it strength again. For a moment the hall was filled with laughter, not from the Queen but from her captains. They laughed at the boldness of the small human. Some said he would break the armor further. Others said he would not live to see the next sun rise. The Queen did not laugh. She did not frown either. Instead, she grew curious. There was fire in her people's weapons, but there was a different fire in the human's words. She decided to give him the chance. With a wave of her hand, the guards brought the broken armor forward and set it on a stand before Aaron. The weight of their stares pressed against him, but he did not look away. His eyes traced the cracks, the dents, the scorched edges. His fingers hovered over the surface, not touching yet, only studying. He asked for tools. The Queen allowed him to have what he needed. Strange looks passed among the warriors as Aaron set down his small case. He opened it and revealed not heavy hammers or glowing forges but delicate instruments of his own making. Wrenches shaped to fit joints, scanners that shone thin beams of light, wires finer than hair. The court watched with disbelief. The human began his work with no hesitation. He cleaned the burns with slow and careful strokes. He removed shattered fragments and set them aside. Where the energy lines had snapped, he began weaving new connections with steady hands. His movements were not rushed. He worked with the patience of someone who had repaired many broken things before. Hours passed. The hall grew quieter. Even the most doubtful captains leaned forward to watch. Aaron spoke little, but his silence was not empty. His silence was filled with focus. The armor's inner light flickered faintly as he connected pieces that others had declared impossible to mend. Where cracks had split the surface, new patterns began to form, patterns that looked stronger than before. Night fell outside, yet the human continued. His hands never shook, his eyes never lost their calm. His tools whispered against the metal, shaping and guiding. The queen sat upon her throne, her eyes never leaving the sight of this lone figure working on what none of her people had dared to touch. The torches burned lower. The guards shifted uneasily, but none left. Something strange was happening. They had expected failure, but the armor was beginning to change. When dawn came, the human finally stood straight. His clothes were marked with dust, his face lined with fatigue, but his eyes were steady. Before him stood the armor, no longer cracked, no longer scorched. Its surface shone with a new light. The scars of battle had been turned into flowing lines of strength. It did not look simply repaired. It looked reborn. The hall was silent once more. The warriors stared in disbelief. The captains muttered, unable to explain what they saw. The queen rose from her throne. Her steps echoed on the stone floor as she approached. She placed her hand upon the armor. A hum filled the chamber, stronger than before. The energy was not only restored, it was brighter, steadier. The armor felt alive in her grasp. The queen turned toward her court. Her voice thundered, demanding to know who had dared to make her armor greater than before. The human bowed his head slightly. His answer was simple. He said it was his duty to fix what was broken. The hall held its breath, waiting for the queen's judgment. The first light of morning spread through the high windows of the queen's hall. The air was still heavy with silence. Every warrior, every captain, every servant stood frozen as the human bowed before the queen. His words had been simple. He had said he only did his duty, that broken things were puzzles, and puzzles deserved to be solved. The queen studied him for a long time. Her eyes were sharp, her expression unreadable. No one knew if she would reward the human or strike him down. The court waited for her command, yet none dared to move. At last the queen spoke. She ordered her guards to take the armor and place it in the chamber of testing. Her voice carried across the hall like thunder, and her order left no room for question. 2 tall guards stepped forward, lifted the glowing armor with care, and carried it away. The queen then turned her gaze upon the human. She asked his name. He answered, his voice calm. His name was Aaron. The queen repeated the name slowly, as if tasting it for the first time. It was not the name of a warrior, not the name of one known in her people's history. It was the name of a worker, someone who built and repaired. That was what made her curious. She ordered Aaron to follow her. The court gasped. It was rare for anyone outside the queen's chosen circle to walk beside her. The captains exchanged uneasy glances, and the servants lowered their heads quickly. Aaron stepped forward, his movements steady, though the weight of countless eyes pressed against his back. The queen led him through long corridors lined with carvings of past victories. Scenes of battles, beasts defeated, and worlds conquered stretched across the walls. Aaron looked at them quietly, his hands folded behind him. He knew these stories were meant to show the power of her people, but he also noticed the details of each carving. He noticed how the armor shapes changed over time, how weapons grew larger, how battle marks grew deeper. His mind kept gathering small details even as he walked in silence. They entered a smaller chamber, lit not by torches but by glowing crystals set into the walls. The chamber was round, and in its center stood a wide table covered with maps and devices. This was not a throne room but a place of strategy. The queen sat at the far end, her gaze sharp. Aaron stood near the entrance, waiting. The queen asked him how he had learned to work with machines in such a way. Aaron replied that humans learn through need. His people had always been weaker than others, so they built tools to protect themselves. They could not match the strength of giants, but they built levers and pulleys. They could not fly with wings, so they built machines that carried them into the air. Every weakness gave them reason to create. The queen leaned forward. She asked if humans feared breaking what they touched. Aaron shook his head. He said that everything eventually breaks. What matters is whether someone is willing to put the pieces back together. The queen's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing for a time. She looked at him as though measuring his spirit. Then she rose and walked to the center of the room. Her presence filled the chamber, tall and unshaken. She told him that he had surprised her court, but surprise was not proof of lasting worth. She said his work would be tested, and if the armor failed in battle, his life would be forfeit. Aaron bowed slightly. He did not argue. He accepted her words without fear. The queen found this strange. Many who stood before her tried to bargain or beg. This human did neither. His calm unsettled her more than fear would have. Outside the chamber, the news of the human's daring spread quickly. Servants whispered about the night of silence when he worked without pause. Guards spoke of the glow that had returned to the armor. Some mocked him still, calling him lucky that the queen had not ended his life at once. Others wondered if perhaps he was different from the rest of his kind. That night Aaron was given a small room in the palace, not far from the workshop where the armor rested. The room was simple, with only a narrow bed, a small desk, and a single lamp. Aaron did not complain. He placed his tools carefully on the desk, cleaned his hands, and sat in silence for a long while. He knew tomorrow would bring questions, perhaps challenges, yet his mind was calm. Far above, the queen stood on a balcony that looked across her city. Towers rose in sharp lines, their tips glowing faintly in the night. Fires burned in the distance where soldiers trained without rest. She thought of her people's pride, of their endless strength, of their fear of weakness. She thought also of the human who had dared to touch what no one else had touched. In the quiet, she admitted something to herself. The armor felt alive in a way it never had before. She had not wanted to believe it, but she could not deny it. The human's work had changed more than the surface. Morning came once again. The queen summoned her captains and warriors to the chamber of testing. The armor was placed upon a stand in the center. Its surface shone under the bright light. Energy lines pulsed faintly, waiting to be awakened. Aaron stood at the side, his hands folded, his tools packed away. The court was filled with murmurs. Many expected failure, others expected drama. No one expected the day to pass quietly. The queen raised her hand, and silence fell. She stepped toward the armor. Slowly, she began to put it on. The chest plate locked with a soft hum. The shoulder guard slid into place, fitting more tightly than before. The helmet lowered, sealing with a sharp click. At once the chamber filled with the sound of energy awakening. The glow grew stronger, flowing along every line. The captains held their breath. The guards stiffened. Even the servants leaned forward to see. The queen stood tall in her reborn armor. She flexed her hands, and the metal moved with perfect balance. She took a step, and the sound rang clear and strong. Then she looked toward her captains and declared that the test would begin. Her words struck the air like a hammer. The time of judgment had come, and all eyes turned not only to the queen but also to the human who had dared to call himself an engineer in a hall of warriors. The chamber of testing was larger than any training hall Aaron had ever seen. Its high walls were built of black stone, polished smooth but scarred with marks from countless battles. Craters and cracks ran across the floor, proof that this place had held tests of fire, blade, and raw strength for generations. The queen stood in the center, her armor gleaming like a living shadow. Energy lines pulsed across its surface, bright enough to cast faint light on the walls. Her presence was already heavy, but in the armor she seemed like a storm given shape. The court circled the edge of the chamber, their eyes locked on her every movement. Aaron stood near the wall, calm yet watchful. He had worked through the night to bring the armor back to life, but his task was not complete. A repair meant little if it could not endure the fury of battle. He knew this was the true test, not just for the armor but for himself. The queen lifted her hand. At once, 3 captains stepped forward. Each captain wore full armor of their own, though none as grand as the queen's. They carried weapons forged for war, one with a spear, one with a heavy blade, and one with twin axes that glowed faintly with heat. The queen's voice rang clear across the hall. She declared that her armor would be tested against her strongest captains, and that no mercy was to be shown. If the armor failed, the blame would fall upon the human who had touched it. The captains bowed and spread out, forming a triangle around her. The court leaned forward, their whispers hushed by the weight of the moment. Aaron folded his hands behind his back. His eyes never left the queen, though he studied every strike that was about to come. The first captain attacked with the spear. He lunged forward, the tip glowing as it cut through the air. The strike landed against the queen's chest with a sharp crack, but the armor held. Sparks scattered, the hum of energy deepened, and the queen did not move back. Instead, she raised her arm and struck with her gauntlet. The force threw the captain across the chamber. He rolled, rose quickly, and steadied himself, but his eyes widened with shock. The second captain rushed in with the heavy blade. His swing was powerful, the edge glowing with heat. The blade crashed down upon the queen's shoulder. The court gasped at the impact, yet when the light cleared, the armor was unbroken. Not only had it endured the strike, it had absorbed some of the heat. The queen's armor glowed brighter at the joint where it had been struck. She turned, caught the blade with her hand, and pushed the captain back as though he weighed nothing. The third captain did not hesitate. With a roar, he leapt forward, both axes swinging. Sparks flew as the weapons struck again and again, raining down upon the armor. The queen stood still, letting the strikes fall. The sound echoed through the chamber, sharp and unrelenting. When at last he stepped back, breathing hard, the armor was still unbroken. Instead of cracks, faint new lines of light had spread across the armor, as though the strikes had awakened hidden strength. The queen flexed her shoulders, lifted her arms, and the glow grew brighter still. The court fell silent. They had expected the armor to survive, but they had not expected it to grow stronger under attack. Even the queen paused for a moment, her eyes narrowing behind the helmet. She had felt it too, the strange way the armor seemed to feed upon the force against it. Her gaze turned toward the human standing by the wall. She said nothing, yet Aaron could see the question in her eyes. He had no weapon, no armor of his own, yet his hands had created what now stood unbroken in the center of the chamber. The queen signaled again. More captains stepped forward. 5 this time. Their weapons were many maces, spears, whips of glowing metal. They surrounded her, their armor clashing as they moved into place. At once they struck together. Blades cut, maces crashed, whips cracked across the air. The chamber shook with the force. Dust fell from the ceiling. For long moments the queen vanished within the storm of strikes. The court leaned forward, some certain this would be the end of the test. Then the storm broke. The queen stood tall, her armor blazing with light. The lines of energy ran brighter than before, every plate shining as though forged anew in fire. She lifted her arms and pushed outward. A wave of force rippled across the chamber, sending all 5 captains staggering back. Not a single dent marked the armor. The silence that followed was deeper than before. The captains stared in disbelief. The court began to murmur, voices rising in awe and confusion. The queen slowly removed her helmet. Her eyes were sharp, but they carried something else now, something rare. It was not anger. It was not amusement. It was surprise. She turned toward Aaron, her voice carrying across the chamber. She demanded to know what he had done. How had a human, with simple tools and quiet words, given her armor such power? Aaron bowed his head slightly. He said he had only followed the lines that were already there. He explained that broken things did not always need to be returned to their old form. Sometimes they could be shaped into something new, something stronger. He had not only repaired the armor but guided its energy into paths that made it grow under strain. The queen's lips curved into something rare upon her face. Not a smile of kindness, but the sharp smile of one who had discovered a new weapon. The court erupted with noise. Some shouted that the human was dangerous. Others argued that he should be honored. The chamber filled with voices clashing like steel. The queen raised her hand, and silence returned at once. She looked at Aaron, her eyes unblinking. She said that he had done what none of her people could. She admitted she was shocked, though she spoke the word as if testing its weight. She declared that his work would not be hidden, for the strength he had given her armor belonged now to her empire. The court bowed, though many faces carried unease. The human had changed something that had stood unchallenged for ages. Aaron remained calm, his expression steady. He had not come to seek glory, yet it had found him in the center of a hall filled with warriors. The queen stood tall in her armor, the light of it filling the chamber. She knew one truth above all others now. A single human had given her what her greatest smiths could not, and the echo of that truth would not fade easily. The queen's armor no longer looked like a tool of war. It looked alive, as though the very spirit of battle had been woven into its plates. When she walked from the chamber of testing into the grand hall, the court followed in silence. No one dared to speak too loudly. Even the sound of footsteps seemed softer, as if the stone floor itself respected the queen's new strength. But the queen was not satisfied with a trial against her own captains. She wanted proof on the field of battle. Armor meant nothing if it could not stand against true danger. She ordered her fleet to prepare for war. A rebellion had grown on a distant moon, one that her armies had been preparing to crush. Now she chose it as the stage for her armor's true trial. Aaron heard the command from where he stood near the edge of the hall. His face did not change, yet his heart beat faster. The queen's words meant more than danger for her enemies. They meant danger for him. If the armor failed, the blame would fall on him. He had no weapon, no army, no power except the work of his hands. Yet he did not step back. The next day the Queen's fleet rose into the sky. Great ships shaped like blades cut through the clouds. Their engines burned like suns, and the noise of their ascent shook the ground. Aaron stood within one of the vessels, looking through a narrow window as the world below grew small. His mind was quiet. He had no part in the coming battle except to watch and wait. The Queen stood at the center of her warship, her captains gathered around her. Her armor glowed faintly, a steady light that pulsed like a heart. She carried no shield, no extra guard. She trusted only the work of the human who had dared to shape her sacred suit. Some captains whispered that this was foolish, yet none spoke it aloud in her presence. The fleet reached the moon by night. Its surface was rough and dark, broken by sharp mountains and deep valleys. Fires burned in the distance where the rebels had gathered. The Queen did not wait for long planning. She ordered her captains to march, and she herself took the lead. The rebels met them with fury. Their weapons burned with blue fire, and their machines rolled forward like iron beasts. The battlefield lit up with explosions and streaks of light. The Queen charged ahead, her armor blazing. The first strikes hit her at once. Bolts of energy slammed into her chest, but the armor absorbed them. The glow along its surface spread wider, as if feeding on the attack. She raised her arm and swung her blade, cutting through enemy lines. Where she moved, her warriors followed. Aaron stood at the edge of the battlefield, guarded by 2 soldiers. He could see everything from the ridge above. His hands tightened as he watched the Queen move through fire and smoke. Each time a weapon struck her, he saw the glow grow brighter. His design was working, but the true test had only begun. A massive machine rolled forward from the rebel side, its shape like a tower of steel. Cannons along its arms fired one after another, shaking the ground. The Queen charged straight toward it. Energy blasts struck her again and again, yet she did not slow. Her armor shone so brightly now that even her warriors had to shield their eyes. With one leap she landed upon the machine and drove her blade deep into its core. The explosion lit the night sky, and the machine collapsed into fire. The court of captains, watching from behind, could not believe what they saw. The Queen had always been strong, but never like this. Her armor made her more than a leader. It made her unstoppable. Still, the battle did not end. The rebels fought with desperation, surrounding the Queen with their remaining warriors. They struck from every side, their blades and weapons raining down. Dust and fire rose high, covering her from view. For a moment even Aaron's heart faltered. He could not see her within the storm of attacks. Then the dust cleared. The Queen stood in the center, her armor glowing as bright as a star. Not a single crack marked its surface. The rebels staggered back, fear breaking their courage. She lifted her hand, and her warriors surged forward with renewed strength. The battle turned quickly after that. The rebels fell, one line after another, until the field was silent except for the sound of victory cries. From the ridge, Aaron let out a slow breath. His work had not failed. The armor had not only endured, it had proven itself stronger than even he had hoped. Yet he also knew what this meant. The Queen had gained more than protection. She had gained a weapon that no one else in her empire could claim. When the battle ended, the Queen returned to her fleet. Her armor still glowed faintly, though the light slowly faded as the fight ended. She removed her helmet, her expression sharp but steady. She looked across the field of her warriors, who bowed in awe. Then her eyes turned toward the ridge where Aaron stood. Later, in the great hall of her ship, the captains gathered. They spoke of her unmatched strength, of the way the armor had turned the tide of battle. Some praised Aaron, saying his skill had given their queen new power. Others warned that a human who could shape such strength might be dangerous. Voices clashed, loud and sharp. The queen raised her hand, and silence fell at once. She looked at Aaron, who stood quietly near the wall. Her voice carried across the hall as she declared that the armor had not failed. She admitted that it had not only survived but had grown stronger in the heart of battle. She said the human had done what her greatest smiths could not. The captains bowed, though unease still shadowed some faces. Aaron bowed as well, but his thoughts were calm. He had proven himself through his work, not through force or pride. He knew the queen's trust was not fully won, yet the path toward it had begun. The queen stood tall in her armor, the faint glow of it still tracing along her shoulders. She looked at Aaron with eyes that no longer held only doubt. They now held something else: respect, though sharp and cautious. The test was complete, but the story of the human engineer and the alien queen was only beginning. The queen's fleet returned to the capital after the victory on the moon. The city welcomed her with cheers that echoed across the towers and streets. Banners flew, horns called, and her people gathered in the plazas to see their ruler return from war. The queen stood tall in her armor as she walked through the palace gates, and the sight of her glowing suit filled her people with pride. To them, it was a sign of unshakable power. But inside the palace, the air was not filled with cheers. In the council chambers, voices rose in dispute. Captains and advisors gathered, their expressions sharp and unsettled. They spoke not of the queen's glory, but of the human who had made it possible. Some praised Aaron, saying his skill had given the queen new strength. They argued that keeping him close would be wise, for his hands could repair and improve beyond their knowledge. They reminded each other that the armor had not only survived the test, it had grown stronger with each strike. Others warned that his presence was dangerous. They said no alien should trust a human with such secrets. They argued that allowing one outsider to touch the sacred armor was a risk to the throne itself. If he could shape the queen's strength, then he also had the power to weaken it. The council grew louder as the voices clashed. The room shook with the sound of argument. The queen sat at the head of the chamber, silent. She listened, her eyes moving from one speaker to another. Her captains did not see the faint curve at the corner of her mouth. She enjoyed hearing their fear, because it meant her enemies would feel it too. Yet even she could not ignore the truth that her court was divided. Aaron heard of these disputes through the whispers of servants. He spent his days in the workshop, repairing smaller weapons and studying alien designs. He asked for little, spoke even less, and worked with steady hands. To him, the court's arguments mattered less than the work before him. He had always lived by one rule: fix what is broken. If trust was broken, it could be mended in time. Still, he noticed the glances. Guards who once ignored him now watched closely. Servants carried messages faster when he walked by, as though they did not want him to overhear. Even the captains came to him with measured words, some respectful, some cold. Aaron answered them all the same, calm and steady. He showed no anger, no pride. He let his work speak for him. The queen summoned him one evening to her private hall. The chamber was smaller than the throne room, its walls lined with maps and banners. She sat on a raised seat, her armor resting nearby. Its faint glow lit the chamber in soft light. She asked Aaron if he knew what her court said about him. He replied that he had heard whispers, but whispers did not trouble him. He said that voices often clashed when change arrived. Some feared it, some embraced it. He added that fear was not proof of weakness, it was only proof that something new had appeared. The queen studied him, her eyes sharp. She asked if he feared her people's anger. Aaron shook his head. He said he feared only failing his work. A broken blade, a failed repair, a piece left incomplete, those were his true worries. People's anger came and went, but broken things stayed broken unless someone cared to mend them. The queen leaned back, her expression unreadable. For a long time she said nothing. Then she told him that his answer was unusual, for most in her hall fought for position, pride, or survival. But he spoke only of his craft. That was what made him strange, and perhaps what made him useful. The next day, the queen held a gathering in the great hall. The captains stood on one side, the advisors on the other. Servants filled the back rows, whispering as they watched. Aaron was called forward to stand beside the throne. The queen rose and spoke of the battle on the moon. She described how her armor had held against fire and blade, how it had grown brighter under the heaviest attacks. She spoke of the machine she had cut down with her own hands. The hall roared with pride. Then her voice grew sharper. She told them the truth that the armor would not have been ready without the hands of the human engineer. At once the hall erupted. Some cried out in approval, others shouted in anger. One captain stepped forward, bold enough to speak against the queen's choice. He said no human should stand so close to her throne. He said trust in Aaron would lead to ruin. The queen fixed her eyes upon him. Her silence was heavy. Then she asked if the captain would have preferred her armor broken in battle. The captain faltered, unable to answer. Another advisor spoke, this time in support of Aaron. He said that strength came not only from swords but from minds that could shape new paths. The queen listened, her face calm. The hall remained divided, but one truth became clear: Aaron's presence could no longer be ignored. He was no longer just a worker at the edge of the hall. He was part of the queen's story, whether the court accepted it or not. That night, Aaron returned to his small chamber. He placed his tools upon the desk and sat in silence. He knew the days ahead would not be easy. He was caught between respect and suspicion, between honor and doubt. Yet his path remained steady. He would keep doing what he knew best. The queen, in her own chambers, stood before her armor. She traced the glowing lines with her hand. She remembered the moment it had shone brightest, feeding on the storm of strikes. She thought of the human who had made it possible. Her court might be divided, but her decision was not. For in her heart she knew this truth: the empire had grown strong through conquest, but it might grow stronger still through creation. And the one who had shown her that path was not a captain, not a warrior, but a lone human engineer. The court was divided, but the queen's mind was clear. The moon was high above the palace when the queen sent for Aaron. The halls were quiet, the torches burned low, and most of the court had gone to rest. Only a few guards stood along the corridors, their armor shining faintly in the dim light. Aaron walked between them without hesitation. His steps were steady, his hands calm at his sides. He was brought into a private chamber, one few were allowed to see. It was not filled with banners or trophies, but with silence. The walls were smooth, the floor plain, and at the center stood only a single table and 2 seats. The queen sat waiting, her armor resting on a stand behind her, glowing faintly like a watchful shadow. She motioned for Aaron to sit across from her. He obeyed, his posture calm. For a time, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the armor's energy. At last the queen spoke. She told him that her people had always believed power came from strength alone. They had built their empire through conquest, through force of arms and fire of war. But what she had seen in her armor had shaken that belief. She asked him how a human, small and fragile compared to her warriors, could shape something greater than all her smiths combined. Aaron listened, then answered with the same calm tone he always carried. He said humans were never the strongest. They were never the fastest, nor the largest. They had always lived among greater dangers, storms, beasts, enemies stronger than themselves. Survival for humans had never come from muscle or claw. It had come from thought. The queen leaned forward, her sharp eyes locked on him. She asked if he meant that weakness had made his people clever. Aaron nodded. He said that every weakness became a reason to build. When cold winds came, they built fire. When rivers blocked their path, they built bridges. When the sky seemed unreachable, they built machines to carry them above the clouds. He explained that fear did not break humans. It guided them toward creation. The queen listened in silence, her expression unreadable. Yet her eyes showed thought, as if his words struck deeper than she wished to admit. She asked him another question. She wanted to know why he had risked his life to repair her armor. He had known that failure would bring death, yet he stepped forward without hesitation. Aaron answered without pause. He said broken things called to him. He could not look away from them. A blade with a crack, a wall with a gap, a suit of armor scarred by battle, these were puzzles waiting to be solved. He said it was not pride or courage that had moved him, but simply his nature. To leave the armor broken would have been a greater failure to him than death. The queen's eyes narrowed, not with anger but with curiosity. She asked if all humans thought like him. Aaron shook his head. He said not all, but many. Some humans fought like warriors, some dreamed like poets, some built like engineers. Together they shaped their world piece by piece. It was not one path, but many paths that crossed and supported each other. That, he said, was why humans endured even when greater powers rose and fell. The queen leaned back in her seat. Her gaze moved to the armor behind her, its glow steady in the shadows. She remembered the way it had grown stronger under attack, how it had seemed to draw power from the very force meant to break it. She thought of Aaron's words about weakness guiding creation. The connection was not lost on her. She asked him one final question, her voice low and sharp. She asked what he saw when he looked at her people. Aaron was silent for a time. His eyes did not wander. At last he answered with care. He said her people were strong, but strength alone was a narrow path. He said they carried pride, but pride could blind as easily as it could guide. He said they had built an empire through conquest, but empires built only on conquest often crumbled when they faced what they could not simply crush. The queen's gaze hardened, but she did not interrupt. Aaron's voice remained steady. He added that her people were not doomed. They had the fire of will, the unity of warriors, and the courage to face storms. If those qualities were joined with creation, not just destruction, they could rise higher than any empire before them. The chamber grew silent again. The queen's face revealed little, but her eyes held thought. She was not used to hearing such words, especially from a human. Most bowed before her, most spoke what they thought she wished to hear. But this one spoke truth, even when it could cost him everything. At last the queen stood. She walked to the armor and placed her hand upon it. The glow spread faintly across her fingers. She turned back toward Aaron, her presence filling the chamber. She told him that his words were dangerous. She said many in her court would see them as insult. Yet she also said that danger often carried truth. She admitted she had learned more from one human's calm voice than from 100 captains shouting of war. Aaron bowed his head slightly. He did not thank her, nor boast. He remained steady, as if her words were simply another piece of the puzzle he worked upon. The queen dismissed him then, but as Aaron left the chamber, her eyes followed him. She stood alone with her armor, thinking of his answers. For the first time in many years, she felt her certainty shift. Strength had always been her foundation, but perhaps strength was not enough. That night, the queen did not sleep. She walked the balcony above her city, her armor glowing faintly behind her in the chamber. She thought of her empire's path, of her court divided, and of the human whose hands had shaped her future. The stars above looked cold and endless, yet they no longer felt unreachable. She wondered if perhaps this was what Aaron had meant when he said humans built bridges where none existed. And as the first light of dawn touched the sky, the queen whispered to herself a truth she had not spoken aloud. The human was not only an engineer of armor. He was an engineer of thought. The great hall of the palace was filled once again. Captains stood in their armor, advisors gathered in long rows, and servants lined the walls in silence. The air was heavy with tension, for everyone knew the queen had called them not for war but for judgment. At the far end of the hall, the queen sat upon her throne. Her armor rested beside her, glowing faintly like a silent guardian. Her eyes swept across the court, sharp and unblinking. At her side stood Aaron, the human engineer, his hands folded behind his back, his posture calm as always. The whispers spread quickly through the hall. Some looked at Aaron with respect, others with suspicion. To them he was more than a worker now. He had changed the queen's armor, and in doing so he had changed the balance of the empire. The queen raised her hand, and silence fell. Her voice rang clear across the chamber. She spoke first of the battle on the moon. She reminded her court of the storm of fire that had rained upon her, of the great machine that had fallen beneath her blade, of the glow that had grown brighter with every strike. She told them her armor had not failed, and that its strength had not come from their own smiths. It had come from the hands of the human beside her. The hall stirred. Some lowered their heads in acceptance, others clenched their fists in anger. One captain stepped forward boldly. He asked the queen how she could trust a human. He warned that giving such honor to an outsider would weaken the throne. His voice carried fear, though he tried to hide it with pride. The queen's eyes locked upon him. She asked if he had stood in her place during the battle. He lowered his gaze. She asked if he had forged armor that could stand against storms of fire. He said nothing. Her silence after that was heavier than any blade, and the captain stepped back in shame. Another advisor rose, his voice softer but filled with concern. He asked if the human would remain loyal, if one day his skill might be turned against them. Aaron answered before the queen could speak. His words were calm, his tone steady. He said loyalty could not be forced by chains or fear. It was given through trust. He added that he had no desire to rule, no hunger for power. His only wish was to fix what was broken, to shape strength where weakness had once stood. The court listened, some frowning, some nodding slowly. The queen rose from her throne. Her presence filled the hall like a storm breaking across the land. She declared that the human engineer had done what none of her people could. He had turned weakness into strength. He had given her armor new life, and through that, he had given her empire new power. She said this truth could not be denied, no matter how much fear or pride stood against it. The hall grew silent. Even those who opposed could not speak against her voice. The queen turned to Aaron. She told him that he had earned not just her respect but a place of honor in her court. She named him Keeper of the Forge, a title never given to one outside her people. It meant he would guide the shaping of weapons, the repair of armor, and the birth of new designs. It meant his hands would not only serve her but shape the path of the empire itself. Gasps filled the hall. Some bowed in respect, others stood frozen in disbelief. But none could deny the queen's word. Aaron bowed his head. He said he would accept the duty, but he asked for one thing in return. He asked that the court not see him only as a human, but as an engineer whose work spoke for itself. He said respect should not come from his origin but from the strength of what he created. The queen's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. She told him his words were wise, though rare in her hall. From that day forward, the palace changed. Aaron worked in the great forge, guiding teams of smiths and builders. He did not command them with pride but taught them with patience. He showed them how to look at cracks not as endings but as beginnings. He showed them how every strike upon metal could carry not just force but purpose. At first many resisted him, but over time even the proudest smiths could not deny the results. Weapons grew stronger, lighter, sharper. Armor carried energy in new ways, glowing with hidden strength. The empire's warriors felt the difference, and their respect grew. The queen often visited the forge, watching from the shadows as Aaron worked. She saw the way he shaped not only metal but minds. She saw how his calm spread to those around him, how doubt turned into curiosity, how pride turned into respect. The court remained divided for some time. Whispers of fear still lingered, voices of suspicion still rose. But slowly, the sound of praise began to grow louder. They could not argue with results. They could not ignore the way their empire grew stronger under the human's guidance. One evening, the queen stood on the balcony of her palace. The city stretched out before her, its towers glowing with light, its streets alive with movement. Aaron stood beside her, his clothes marked with dust from the forge. She asked him if he understood what he had done. Aaron shook his head slightly. He said he had only fixed what was broken. The queen looked at him, her sharp eyes softer than before. She told him that he had done more than fix armor. He had fixed the path of her people. He had shown them that strength was not only in conquest but in creation. For a long time they stood in silence, watching the city. The stars above shone bright, endless, and far. The queen thought of new battles, new worlds, and new challenges. But she also thought of something greater. Perhaps the human was right. Perhaps an empire built only on conquest would fall, but an empire that could create as well as destroy might last forever. In the days that followed, the queen's words spread through the court. She declared openly that the human engineer was part of her legacy. His name would be remembered not as a servant, not as a stranger, but as the one who had given her empire new strength. The hall roared with voices, some in agreement, some in protest. Yet none could change the truth. The queen had spoken, and her word was law. And so Aaron's story was sealed. He had come as a worker, quiet and small among giants. He had stepped forward when none dared. He had turned broken armor into living strength. In doing so, he had changed not only the fate of the queen but the course of an empire. His legacy would not fade, for the halls of the palace now carried a name once spoken in whispers, now carried with pride. The name of the lone human engineer.